thought I was just doing my job when I caught that accounting error. I had no idea it would expose an affair, destroy careers, and turn me into the office hero who saved the company millions. But sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep people try to bury it. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been working as a senior financial analyst at Henderson Technologies for 8 years. It's a mid-sized tech company in downtown Seattle, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and office politics run deeper than the Puget Sound. The rain was pounding against the 15th floor windows that Tuesday morning in March, creating rivulets that distorted the view of Elliott Bay below. I was reviewing quarterly reports when I noticed something that made my coffee grow cold. Before we dive deeper into this story, I want to let you know that we're doing something special for our subscribers. We're giving away a brand new motorcycle to one lucky winner who subscribes to our channel, gives this video a thumbs up, and comments below telling us where you're watching from. The drawing will happen at the end of this month, so make sure you're subscribed and engaged. Now, let's get back to how one spreadsheet changed everything. The numbers weren't adding up in the third quarter financial projections. As someone who'd been crunching numbers since college, I had developed an almost supernatural ability to spot inconsistencies. The procurement department was showing expenditures that were 47% higher than the previous year, but there was no corresponding increase in inventory or project deliverables. It was like money had simply vanished into thin air. Henderson Technologies had been my professional home since I graduated from the University of Washington with my accounting degree. I started as a junior analyst, working my way up through late nights, weekend projects, and a reputation for catching details that others missed. The company culture was collaborative but competitive, with an open office layout that encouraged interaction while sometimes making privacy impossible. I pulled up the detailed breakdown, my fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. The discrepancies were buried deep in subsidiary accounts, the kind of places where someone might think no one would look too carefully. But I always looked carefully. It's what made me good at my job, and it's probably what made some people resent me. My cubicle was positioned near the procurement department, which meant I often overheard conversations about vendor relationships, contract negotiations, and spending approvals. Over the years, I developed a mental map of how money flowed through the organization, which department spent what, and which expenses typically fluctuated with business cycles. The largest anomaly was a series of payments to a consulting firm called Meridian Strategic Solutions. Over 18 months, they had received nearly $2.4 million for what was described as operational efficiency consulting. The problem was, I'd never heard of any efficiency consulting project. In a company of our size, word travels fast about major initiatives, especially ones that cost that much money. I decided to dig deeper, pulling up vendor contracts and project authorizations. That's when I discovered that all the payments to Meridian Strategic had been approved by Sarah Mitchell, our procurement director, and signed off on by David Henderson himself, our CEO and the founder's son. The authorization codes were all legitimate, the paperwork looked official, but something felt wrong. Sarah Mitchell was 34, blonde, and had joined the company 3 years ago after working for a larger firm in Portland. She was competent, professional, and had quickly earned David's trust. Maybe too quickly, I was starting to realize. David was 42, recently divorced, and had been throwing himself into work with an intensity that worried his friends in the office. The divorce had been messy and public, with David's ex-wife claiming half of his company shares and making allegations about his dedication to work over family. The settlement had cost him millions and left him emotionally vulnerable. Sarah had arrived just 6 months after the divorce was finalized, bringing impressive credentials and a warm personality that seemed to lift David's spirits. I remembered the office holiday party 18 months ago, where I'd noticed David and Sarah talking quietly by the punch bowl, their conversation seeming more intimate than typical workplace small talk. At the time, I dismissed it as harmless flirtation, but now I was beginning to wonder if there had been more to it. I spent the next 2 days quietly investigating, staying late after most people had gone home. The office felt different at night, with only the cleaning crew and the occasional workaholic keeping me company. The city lights reflected off the wet streets below, and I found myself wondering if I was opening a door I might not be able to close. My investigation methods were thorough but careful. I used only information I had legitimate access to, avoiding anything that might constitute unauthorized snooping. I cross-referenced payment dates with project timelines, compared vendor contracts with similar agreements from previous years, and analyzed spending patterns across different departments. The trail led me to some interesting discoveries. Meridian Strategic Solutions was incorporated in Delaware, which wasn't unusual for consulting firms, but their business address was a mailbox service. Their website looked professional but was suspiciously generic, full of stock photos and buzzword-heavy descriptions of services that could mean almost anything. I tried calling the phone number listed on their website, but it went to a generic voicemail that didn't mention the company name. Their LinkedIn page showed only 2 employees, both with vague job titles and profile photos that looked like stock images. For a consulting firm that was supposedly earning millions in annual revenue, their online presence was remarkably thin. More concerning was the pattern of payments. They weren't random or spread out like typical consulting fees. Instead, they followed a very specific schedule, coming every 2 weeks like clockwork, always for amounts just under the threshold that would require additional board approval. Someone had clearly thought this through very carefully. The payment amounts were also suspicious. Most consulting firms bill for actual hours worked, with invoices that detail specific services provided and time spent on different activities. But Meridian Strategic's invoices were remarkably vague, listing services like strategic planning support, operational efficiency analysis, and workflow optimization without any specific deliverables or measurable outcomes. I cross-referenced the payment dates with Sarah's calendar, which I could access through our internal system for coordination purposes. The correlation was remarkable. Every payment authorization coincided with days when Sarah had blocked out hours marked as meetings with David. These weren't short 15-minute check-ins either. They were 2- and 3-hour blocks, often scheduled during lunch or at the end of the day. The pattern was so consistent that it couldn't be coincidental. It appeared that Sarah was meeting with David, getting approval for payments, and then processing them through the system within hours of their private meetings. The timing suggested a level of coordination that went beyond normal business relationships. I also noticed that these meetings were often scheduled in David's private conference room rather than his main office, and they frequently occurred when other senior staff members were out of the building. It was as if they were deliberately avoiding oversight or interruption. The picture that was emerging made my stomach churn. I'd stumbled onto what appeared to be a systematic embezzlement scheme, and if my suspicions were correct, it involved the CEO and one of his direct reports. The implications were staggering, not just for the company but for all of us who worked there. Henderson Technologies employed nearly 400 people across 3 departments. We had engineers developing cutting-edge software solutions, sales teams building relationships with major clients, and support staff who kept everything running smoothly. If the company was being systematically robbed by its own leadership, everyone's job security was at risk. I thought about my colleagues, many of whom I'd worked with for years. There was Jennifer in accounting, who was saving to buy her first house. Tom in engineering had just had his second child and was already worried about college tuition. Maria in sales was supporting her elderly parents while building her own retirement fund. They all trusted that the company was being managed responsibly and that their paychecks would continue coming. On Thursday afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I compiled all my findings into a comprehensive report, complete with transaction records, timeline correlations, and copies of all the relevant documentation. The rain had stopped, and pale March sunlight was filtering through the conference room windows as I prepared to take the information to someone I trusted. That someone was Janet Williams, our chief financial officer and David's aunt. Janet was 62, sharp as a tack, and had been with the company since its founding 20 years ago. She was also one of the few people in the organization with enough clout to challenge David if necessary. Janet had started as the company bookkeeper when Henderson Technologies was just 5 employees working out of a converted warehouse in Georgetown. She'd watched the company grow from a startup with big dreams to a major player in the regional tech industry. Her office was filled with photos documenting the company's history, from groundbreaking ceremonies to product launches to industry awards. I knocked on Janet's office door just after 4 o'clock, my heart hammering against my ribs. She looked up from her computer, her reading glasses perched on her nose, and gestured for me to come in. Her office had the same view of Elliott Bay that I admired from my cubicle, but from 2 floors higher and with much larger windows. I've always been bad at small talk, so I got straight to the point. I laid out my findings methodically, watching Janet's expression grow increasingly grim as I explained what I discovered. She asked pointed questions, examined the documentation carefully, and made notes in her precise handwriting. Janet's questions revealed the depth of her financial expertise and her understanding of the company's operations. She wanted to know about my methodology, the reliability of my sources, and the potential for alternative explanations for what I'd found. Her thoroughness was both intimidating and reassuring, confirming that she was taking my allegations seriously. When I finished, Janet leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tight with controlled anger. She told me I'd done excellent work and that she would handle the situation from here. She also made it clear that I should keep this information confidential until she decided how to proceed. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Janet asking detailed questions about timelines, amounts, and documentation. She wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how it had been possible and what controls had failed to prevent it. Her business acumen was evident in every question, and I could see why she'd been trusted with the company's financial oversight for 2 decades. I went home that evening feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. I'd done the right thing, but I knew the fallout was going to be significant. My apartment in Capitol Hill felt too quiet, so I took a long walk through the neighborhood, trying to process what I'd uncovered and what it might mean for everyone involved. The next morning, I arrived at work to find Sarah waiting by my desk. She was dressed impeccably as always, but there was something different about her demeanor. Her smile seemed forced, and her usually confident posture appeared slightly strained. She was holding a manila folder and kept glancing toward David's office as if expecting him to appear at any moment. She asked if we could talk privately, suggesting we grab coffee in the small break room on the 14th floor. I followed her, curious about what she wanted to discuss but also nervous about the timing. The break room was empty, the coffee machine gurgling softly as it brewed a fresh pot. The space was cramped, with a small table and 4 chairs, making the conversation feel uncomfortably intimate. Sarah closed the door behind us and got straight to the point. She told me that David had been reviewing departmental efficiency and had decided that my skills would be better utilized in a different role. Effective immediately, I was being transferred to the internal audit department, where I'd be working on compliance documentation and regulatory filings. The transfer meant a lateral move in terms of pay and benefits, but it would effectively remove me from any involvement in financial analysis or procurement oversight. It was, she explained with that same forced smile, an opportunity to expand my skill set and take on new challenges. The internal audit department was located on a different floor and reported to a different manager, essentially isolating me from the financial operations I'd been investigating. I listened to her explanation, but I could see right through it. This wasn't about expanding my skills or taking on new challenges. This was about neutralizing a threat. Sarah had somehow learned about my investigation, and she was making sure I couldn't cause any more trouble. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I accepted the transfer with as much grace as I could muster, but inside I was furious. Not just at being pushed aside, but at the confirmation that my suspicions had been correct. If Sarah was willing to get me reassigned to protect herself, then she was definitely guilty of something significant. The internal audit department was a professional backwater, handling routine compliance tasks that were important but not particularly challenging or visible. It was the kind of place where competent employees went to coast toward retirement or where problem employees were sent to keep them out of trouble. For someone with my ambitions and abilities, it felt like professional exile. That weekend, I made another decision that would prove to be crucial. Instead of just accepting my fate and moving to the audit department, I decided to continue my investigation on my own time. I had copies of all the relevant documents, and there were still pieces of the puzzle I hadn't fully explored. I spent Saturday and Sunday diving deeper into Meridian Strategic Solutions, using public records databases and business registration sites to trace the company's ownership structure. What I found was even more damning than I'd expected. My home office, which usually served for paying bills and online shopping, became a war room filled with printed documents, sticky notes, and a growing conspiracy board that connected dots across multiple states. The company was owned by a shell corporation registered in Nevada, which was in turn owned by another shell corporation incorporated in Wyoming, creating a maze of legal entities that obscured the true ownership. Each layer required filing fees, registered agents, and annual reports, suggesting someone with significant resources and business sophistication. But after following the trail through 3 different states and 2 offshore accounts, I found the smoking gun. The ultimate beneficiary of Meridian Strategic Solutions was a trust fund registered in the Cayman Islands, and the sole beneficiary of that trust was Sarah Mitchell herself. She had created an elaborate network of companies to funnel money from Henderson Technologies into her own accounts, using her position and her relationship with David to authorize payments that lined her pockets. The complexity of the scheme was breathtaking. Sarah hadn't just created a fake consulting company. She'd built an entire financial infrastructure designed to launder money and hide her ownership. The setup would have required legal advice, accounting expertise, and significant upfront investment. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned and executed fraud that had been years in the making. But that wasn't all. I also discovered that Sarah's relationship with David extended far beyond the office. Property records showed that they had jointly purchased a condominium in Bellevue 6 months ago, a luxury unit overlooking Lake Washington that cost nearly $800,000. Credit card records that I managed to access through some creative internet searching revealed romantic dinners, weekend getaways to Vancouver and San Francisco, and expensive gifts including jewelry and designer clothing. The personal relationship added another layer to the fraud scheme. Sarah wasn't just stealing from the company. She was stealing from her lover, using his feelings for her to justify millions of dollars in fraudulent payments. The emotional manipulation was perhaps even more disturbing than the financial theft, showing a level of callousness that suggested this wasn't Sarah's first experience with deception and fraud. I also found evidence that David had been incredibly generous with company resources when it came to Sarah. She'd been given a company credit card with an unusually high limit, her travel expenses were rarely questioned, and she'd been allowed to hire additional staff without going through normal approval processes. David's infatuation had clearly compromised his business judgment. By Sunday evening, I had assembled a complete picture of the scheme. Sarah had been systematically embezzling company funds for over 2 years, using her relationship with David to ensure that her fraudulent consulting contracts were approved without question. The total amount stolen was approaching $3 million. Money that could have funded significant business expansion, employee bonuses, or research and development initiatives. On Monday morning, I walked into Janet Williams's office with a much more comprehensive report than the one I'd brought her the previous week. This time, I had bank records, property documents, business registrations, shell company structures, and a detailed timeline that showed exactly how the fraud had been perpetrated and concealed. Janet reviewed everything carefully, her face growing pale as she realized the full scope of what Sarah had done. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with a mixture of gratitude and concern. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of anger and disappointment, emotions that were rare for someone with her professional experience and family connection to the company. She told me that she had already begun her own investigation after our previous meeting and had reached similar conclusions about the fraudulent nature of the Meridian strategic payments. However, she hadn't been able to trace the money trail as thoroughly as I had. The documentation I'd provided would be crucial in building a case against Sarah and potentially recovering the stolen funds. But Janet also shared some disturbing news that explained why Sarah had felt confident enough to have me reassigned. David had become aware that there was an investigation into the procurement department's spending, and he was actively trying to protect Sarah. Whether he knew about the embezzlement or was simply trying to shield someone he cared about, his interference was making it difficult to proceed through normal channels. David had already instructed the Human Resources Department to limit access to financial records, claiming that too many people were reviewing confidential information without proper authorization. He'd also changed approval procedures for releasing internal documents, requiring his personal sign-off for any investigations involving senior staff members. These changes effectively gave him veto power over any investigation that might implicate Sarah. That's when Janet made a proposal that would give me a chance to get the justice I was seeking while also protecting the company's interests. The board of directors was scheduled to meet Thursday morning for their monthly review session. Janet could arrange for me to present my findings directly to the board, bypassing David entirely and ensuring that the truth came out regardless of his attempts to interfere. The board meeting would be my one opportunity to present the evidence before David could take more drastic steps to protect Sarah or destroy incriminating documents. If I could convince the board that Sarah was stealing from the company, they would have the authority to take immediate action regardless of David's objections. I agreed immediately. This was my chance to make sure that Sarah couldn't escape consequences for what she'd done, and it was also my opportunity to prove that trying to sideline me had been a serious mistake. The stakes were enormous, not just for Sarah and David, but for the entire company and everyone who worked there. I spent the next 3 days preparing for the board presentation, creating charts, graphs, and visual aids that would make the fraud scheme impossible to ignore. I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly, anticipating questions and preparing detailed answers for every possible inquiry the board might have. The preparation was intense and stressful. I had to be ready to explain complex financial relationships, legal structures, and investigative methodologies to a group of successful business leaders who would be looking for any weaknesses in my analysis. One mistake or poorly answered question could undermine my credibility and allow Sarah to escape consequences. I also had to consider the personal dynamics that would be in play during the presentation. David would be in the room, potentially trying to discredit my findings or defend Sarah. Some board members might be reluctant to believe that the CEO had been manipulated or that a senior manager was capable of such elaborate fraud. I needed to be prepared for skepticism, hostility, and attempts to minimize the significance of what I'd discovered. Thursday morning arrived with typical Seattle weather, a light drizzle that matched my nervous energy. The boardroom was on the 20th floor, with panoramic windows that offered stunning views of the city and the sound beyond. The 12-person board included company founders, major investors, independent directors, and family members, all successful business people who would understand the implications of what I was about to share. The boardroom itself was intimidating, with a massive conference table made of polished mahogany and leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. The walls were decorated with awards, patents, and photos documenting the company's 20-year history. This was where the most important decisions about the company's future were made, and I was about to ask them to make one of the most difficult decisions in the organization's history. Janet introduced me as a senior financial analyst who had uncovered some concerning irregularities in company spending. I could see David's face tighten with worry as he realized what was about to happen, but it was too late for him to intervene. The other board members looked curious but not alarmed, clearly expecting a routine presentation about budget variances or accounting adjustments. I began my presentation with the basic numbers that had first caught my attention, then methodically built the case layer by layer. I showed them the suspicious payment patterns, the shell companies, the forged documentation, and the personal relationship that had enabled the entire scheme. Each piece of evidence was carefully explained and connected to the larger pattern of fraud and deception. The room was completely silent as I spoke, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning system and the occasional rustle of papers as board members took notes. I could feel the tension building as the full scope of the fraud became clear and the implications for the company's leadership became undeniable. When I reached the financial impact section of my presentation, I could see several board members exchanging glances of concern and disbelief. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had stolen nearly $3 million over 2 years, money that could have funded research and development, employee bonuses, facility improvements, or business expansion initiatives that would have benefited everyone in the organization. But the most dramatic moment came when I presented the evidence of the personal relationship between David and Sarah. I had photos of them together at restaurants, property records showing their joint purchases, travel records documenting romantic getaways, and financial records that documented expensive trips and gifts paid for with company money or funded by stolen funds. David tried to interrupt at that point, claiming that his personal life was irrelevant to the company's business and that I was making inappropriate accusations based on circumstantial evidence. But the board chairman, David's uncle Robert Henderson, cut him off firmly. The personal relationship was absolutely relevant because it explained how Sarah had been able to perpetrate such an extensive fraud without detection and why David had failed in his fiduciary duty to protect the company's assets. The presentation concluded with my recommendations for immediate action. Sarah should be terminated immediately and criminal charges should be filed with both local authorities and federal agencies that handle financial crimes. The company should also conduct a comprehensive audit of all vendor relationships to ensure that similar schemes weren't operating in other departments. I also recommended that the board consider bringing in outside forensic accountants to review the company's financial controls and recommend improvements that would prevent similar fraud in the future. The current incident had revealed significant weaknesses in oversight and approval processes that needed to be addressed to protect shareholders and employees. The board asked thoughtful and sometimes challenging questions about my methodology, the strength of the evidence, the potential for recovery of the stolen funds, and the legal implications of the various courses of action available to them. I answered each question thoroughly, demonstrating that I had considered every angle and verified every fact multiple times. Some board members were clearly angry about the betrayal of trust and the damage to the company's reputation. Others seemed more focused on the practical implications of pursuing legal action and the potential for recovering the stolen money. All of them appeared concerned about the leadership crisis that would result from David's compromised position. When the formal presentation ended, the board went into executive session to discuss their response. I was asked to wait in an adjacent conference room while they deliberated. Through the glass walls, I could see heated discussions and animated gestures as the directors grappled with the implications of what they'd learned and the difficult decisions they needed to make. After 2 hours that felt like an eternity, Janet came to get me. The board had voted unanimously to accept my recommendations with some additional measures. Sarah would be terminated immediately, her access to company systems would be revoked, and security would escort her from the building. The evidence would be turned over to law enforcement within 24 hours, and the company would pursue both criminal charges and civil recovery of the stolen funds. David had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into his role in the fraud and his fitness to continue as CEO. While there was no evidence that he had knowingly participated in the embezzlement, his relationship with Sarah and his attempts to obstruct the investigation raised serious questions about his judgment and leadership abilities. The board also voted to promote me to Director of Financial Controls, a newly created position that would give me responsibility for overseeing all financial transactions and vendor relationships. It was a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase, and it represented the board's confidence in my integrity and analytical abilities. As I walked back to my desk to clean out my things before moving to my new office, I passed Sarah's workspace. Security guards were already there, supervising as she packed her personal items into cardboard boxes. She looked up as I walked by, and for just a moment, our eyes met. There was no anger in her expression, no defiance or indignation. Instead, she looked tired and defeated, like someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for too long and was almost relieved to finally put it down. She nodded slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or even respect, then went back to packing. The news of Sarah's termination spread through the office within hours, followed quickly by rumors about the reasons behind it. I didn't contribute to the speculation, but I didn't have to. The truth has a way of revealing itself, and by the end of the week, most people had figured out what had happened. Some of my colleagues approached me to express their admiration for what I'd done, calling me brave for standing up to corruption even when it put my own job at risk. Others seemed uncomfortable around me, perhaps worried that I might be investigating their activities as well or concerned about the implications of the leadership crisis. The investigation continued for several more weeks, with forensic accountants and federal agents examining every aspect of the fraud scheme. Sarah was eventually charged with embezzlement, money laundering, wire fraud, and tax evasion. She pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, with an order to pay full restitution to the company. David's fate was more complicated. The investigation found no evidence that he had knowingly participated in the embezzlement, but his relationship with Sarah and his attempts to interfere with the investigation led to his resignation as CEO. The board felt that his judgment had been compromised and that his continued leadership would damage the company's reputation and credibility with clients, investors, and employees. The recovery of the stolen funds took nearly 2 years and involved legal proceedings in multiple jurisdictions. The company was eventually able to recoup most of what had been taken through asset seizures, insurance claims, and restitution payments. The recovered money was reinvested in employee benefits, research and development, and facility improvements, creating tangible benefits for everyone who worked there. For me, the experience was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. I'd always seen myself as just a numbers guy, someone who worked behind the scenes to keep the financial machinery running smoothly. But the fraud investigation had taught me that numbers tell stories, and sometimes those stories need someone willing to listen and act on what they hear. My new role as Director of Financial Controls gave me the authority and resources to implement systemic changes that would prevent similar fraud schemes in the future. I established new verification procedures for vendor contracts, created mandatory cross-department reviews for large expenditures, developed reporting mechanisms that encouraged employees to raise concerns about suspicious activities, and implemented regular audits of all significant financial relationships. The changes weren't just bureaucratic improvements. They represented a cultural shift toward greater transparency and accountability. Employees felt more comfortable raising questions about financial irregularities, knowing that their concerns would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Management became more careful about maintaining proper documentation and following established procedures. Looking back on those turbulent months, I'm struck by how one small discrepancy in a quarterly report led to such massive changes in the company's leadership, culture, and financial controls. If I hadn't noticed those procurement irregularities, or if I dismissed them as minor accounting errors, Sarah might have continued stealing from the company for years, potentially bankrupting the organization and costing hundreds of people their jobs. The experience also taught me important lessons about the complexity of human relationships and the dangers of unchecked power. Sarah wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a competent professional who had made increasingly poor choices until she found herself trapped in a web of lies and fraud. Her relationship with David had started as genuine affection but had become a tool for manipulation and theft. David, too, was more complex than he initially appeared. He wasn't a co-conspirator in the fraud, but his feelings for Sarah had clouded his judgment and made him vulnerable to manipulation. His attempts to protect her, even after evidence of wrongdoing emerged, showed how personal relationships can compromise professional responsibilities and fiduciary duties. The aftermath of the investigation brought unexpected benefits beyond just recovering the stolen money and removing corrupt leadership. The company's reputation for integrity and transparency actually improved as news of our proactive response to the fraud became public. Clients and partners appreciated our willingness to confront corruption and implement stronger controls, leading to new business opportunities and strengthened relationships. My own career trajectory changed dramatically as well. The visibility I gained from exposing the fraud led to speaking opportunities at industry conferences, where I shared insights about detecting and preventing financial fraud. I also began consulting with other companies that wanted to strengthen their financial controls and create more transparent reporting systems. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the knowledge that I had protected my colleagues and the company we all worked for. Henderson Technologies employed nearly 400 people, many of whom had families depending on their paychecks. Sarah's fraud had threatened all of those livelihoods, and by stopping her scheme, I had helped ensure that everyone could continue working and supporting their families. Today, 5 years after that rainy Tuesday morning when I first noticed the procurement irregularities, Henderson Technologies is stronger than ever. We've grown our workforce to over 600 employees, expanded our product lines to serve new markets, and maintain the ethical standards that the board established in the wake of the fraud investigation. I still work there, now as Chief Financial Officer, having been promoted when Janet Williams retired 2 years ago. My office has the same view of Elliott Bay that I used to admire from my analyst desk. But now I see it with the perspective of someone who understands that protecting an organization's integrity is just as important as protecting its profitability. The rain still pounds against the windows during Seattle's long winter months, creating those same rivulets that distort the view of the water beyond. But I've learned that sometimes distortion can be helpful, forcing you to look more carefully and see things that might otherwise be hidden in plain sight. Every quarterly report that crosses my desk gets the same careful attention I gave to that fateful document 5 years ago. Because I know that numbers tell stories, and sometimes those stories reveal truths that powerful people would prefer to keep buried. But the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep people try to bury it, especially when there are people willing to listen to what the numbers are trying to say.